Commander Vex Thorn was having what the humans would call a monumentally bad day, though he wouldn't understand that reference for another 20 minutes. The emergency klaxon had been wailing for 6 straight hours in the Galactic Wildlife Protection Agency headquarters, which was approximately 5 hours and 59 minutes longer than his patience typically lasted. "Sir, we've lost another rescue team," announced Lieutenant Crix, his voice carrying that special tone reserved for delivering news that would make someone's day significantly worse. "That's the 5th one today." Vex's 4 eyes blinked in sequence, a nervous habit he'd developed during his 40-year career of dealing with the galaxy's most dangerous wildlife situations. "Lost them how, exactly?" "Well, technically they're not lost, sir. They just refused to get within 3 parsecs of the research station. Captain Brutox of the Heavy Assault Marines sent a message." Crix consulted his tablet, clearing his throat dramatically. Quote, "I'd rather wrestle a Venusian acid spitter with my bare tentacles than deal with those things," unquote. "Those things," Vex repeated slowly, "being cubs." "Yes, sir, baby Razorfangs." Vex leaned back in his chair, which protested with a squeak that somehow managed to sound judgmental. Razorfangs were the apex predators of the Outer Rim, creatures so terrifying that entire star systems had been abandoned just because someone thought they saw one in the distance. Adult Razorfangs had been known to hunt battlecruisers for sport, and now, somehow, 3 cubs were trapped on Research Station Omega-7, which was currently doing its best impression of a collapsing house of cards in a hurricane. "How long until the station's structural integrity gives out completely?" he asked, though he was pretty sure he didn't want to know the answer. 18 hours, sir. Maybe less if they keep trying to claw their way out of the containment area." Beck stared at the holographic display showing the station's deteriorating condition. Red warnings blinked like angry Christmas lights, if Christmas lights could convey existential dread. The irony wasn't lost on him that the galaxy's most feared predators were currently trapped like kittens in a tree, except this tree was in space and about to explode. "Sir?" Crix ventured cautiously. "There is one option we haven't tried yet." Vex's expression suggested he was preparing for news that would somehow make his day even worse. "And that would be?" "We could call a human." The silence that followed was the kind of silence that occurs when someone suggests something so outrageous that it temporarily breaks everyone's ability to process language. Vex's 4 eyes blinked again, but this time not in sequence. This was more of a system reboot blink. "A human," he repeated, as if testing how the words felt in his mouth. They tasted like desperation, with notes of insanity. "I do have a reputation for handling dangerous animals, sir. There was that incident last year where one of them convinced a pack of death wolves to form an orderly queue for medical treatment." Vex remembered that report. He'd filed it under unexplained phenomena because the alternative was filing it under humans are absolutely insane, and that folder was getting uncomfortably thick. "Get me a human," he said finally, the words coming out like he was ordering his own execution. "And Lieutenant, make sure they're certified for dangerous animal rescue. The last thing we need is some amateur getting eaten on live galactic news feeds." "Already on it, sir. I found someone perfect. Jake Morrison, wildlife specialist from Earth. His references are interesting." As Crix busied himself with making what was possibly the strangest emergency call in GWPA history, Vex couldn't help but wonder if this was how his career was going to end. Not with a bang, not with a whimper, but with a human doing something that would probably make him question everything he thought he knew about the universe. Again, the video call connected with that peculiar static that suggested it was traveling through about 17 different relay stations, each one probably wondering why anyone would want to contact the 3rd planet from an unremarkable yellow star. When Jake Morrison's face appeared on screen, Vex's first thought was that this had to be some kind of mistake. The human was sitting in what appeared to be a kitchen, casually spooning cereal into his mouth, while wearing a t-shirt that read, "I survived the Australian outback and all I got was this lousy scar." He looked like he'd just rolled out of bed, which, given Earth's time zones, he probably had. "Morning," Jake said around a mouthful of cereal, raising his spoon in what Vex assumed was a greeting. "You the guy with the animal problem?" Vex struggled to reconcile this laid-back individual with the species that had somehow convinced death wolves to form queues. "Commander Vex Thorn, Galactic Wildlife Protection Agency." "Mr. Morrison, I need to stress the severity of this situation. We have 3 Razorfang cubs trapped on a collapsing research station. Every trained rescue team in the sector has refused the mission." Jake paused mid-chew, raising an eyebrow. "Razorfangs. Those are the big lizard cat things with all the teeth? Lizard cat things, Vex repeated faintly. Mr. Morrison, these are apex predators. Adult razor fangs have been known to hunt starships. Their cubs are still capable of ripping through reinforced titanium with their claws. Right, scared babies then, Jake nodded, taking another bite. How old are we talking? Approximately 6 months in your Earth time. So basically teenagers. Got it. Jake set down his bowl and leaned closer to the screen. What's the timeline? 17 hours before complete structural failure. Jake glanced at something off-screen, presumably a clock. I can be there in 12. What's the pay? Vex blinked all 4 eyes simultaneously. In his 40 years of wildlife management, no one had ever asked about payment before asking about survival odds. Standard galactic rescue rates apply, but, Mr. Morrison, I feel I should emphasize that these creatures have terrified experienced combat veterans. Our best military units won't go near them. Yeah, that's usually the problem, Jake said, standing up and walking toward what looked like an equipment closet. People see big teeth and claws and assume the worst. Most of the time, scared animals just need someone who isn't afraid of them. Mr. Morrison, with all due respect, your species has something of a reputation in the galactic community. Jake paused in his packing, a curious expression crossing his face. What kind of reputation? Vex consulted his notes, wondering how to diplomatically explain that most of the galaxy considered humans to be certifiably insane. You're the species that domesticated wolves, and then looked at tigers and thought those would make good pets too. There are reports of your people keeping venomous snakes in glass containers in their homes, for fun. Oh, that reputation, Jake grinned, tossing what appeared to be a spray bottle into a duffel bag. Yeah, fair enough. Look, Commander, animals are animals. Doesn't matter if they're from Earth or the Outer Rim. They want food, safety, and not to be scared. Everything else is just details. Details, Vex muttered, watching the human pack what looked suspiciously like dog treats alongside serious-looking rescue equipment. Mr. Morrison, what exactly is your plan for handling 3 terrified apex predators? Jake held up the spray bottle. Same thing I use on misbehaving house cats. Firm, but gentle guidance, positive reinforcement, and, if all else fails, distraction techniques. He paused, considering. Might want to have the station's food replicators ready to produce about 50 pounds of fresh meat. Growing cubs are always hungry. You're going to feed them? Well, yeah. Hard to be scared and angry when you're having dinner. As Jake continued his apparently casual preparation for what every military expert in the galaxy had deemed a suicide mission, Vex found himself wondering if humans were brave, insane, or if there was actually no difference between the two. Transport will be there in an hour, Vex said finally. And Mr. Morrison, good luck. Thanks, Commander. Oh, and don't worry about the whole apex predator thing. I grew up in Florida. This should be pretty routine. The call ended, leaving Vex staring at a blank screen and wondering what, exactly, he had just unleashed upon the galaxy. 12 hours later, Jake Morrison arrived at the disaster site aboard the transport ship Cautious Optimism, a name that Captain Zilt was beginning to think showed a dangerous lack of foresight. The good news was that Research Station Omega-7 was still structurally intact. The bad news was that structurally intact was being generous, and the station was now listing at an angle that suggested it was auditioning for a role in a disaster movie. Human vessel, this is Rescue Command, came Vex's voice over the comm, tinged with what Jake was learning to recognize as perpetual anxiety. Please maintain minimum safe distance of 50,000 kilometers until we can assess the situation. Jake looked out the viewport at the other rescue ships, which were maintaining what could generously be called a neighborhood safe distance. Some of them appeared to be parked in entirely different star systems. Copy that, Command, Captain Zilt replied, his tentacles nervously adjusting controls. Though I should mention, our passengers seems to have different ideas about what constitutes a safe distance. Jake was already suiting up in the transport bay, checking his equipment with the same casual efficiency most people reserved for packing lunch. Captain, how close can you get me to the docking bay? Close? Zilt's voice cracked slightly. Friend Jake, the docking bay has warning signs in 47 different languages. 3 of them just say no in increasingly large fonts. Yeah, but those are for people who don't know what they're doing, Jake said, clipping a utility belt loaded with what looked like pet supplies around his waist. I brought jerky. Through the viewports, they could see Research Station Omega-7 rotating slowly, occasional sparks flying from damaged sections. What they couldn't see, but everyone knew was there, were 3 juvenile razorfangs somewhere in the containment levels, probably working themselves into an increasingly agitated state. All stations, this is Rescue Command. Vex's voice crackled over the general frequency. The human is requesting immediate approach to the docking bay. All observers are advised to maintain current distances and prepare emergency jump coordinates. Emergency jump coordinates? Jake asked, raising an eyebrow as he checked his oxygen levels. Standard protocol when dealing with your species, Captain Zilt explained apologetically. Last time humans got involved with a rescue operation, they somehow convinced a colony of void spiders to help with repairs. The paperwork alone took 6 months. Jake shrugged, pulling on his helmet. Sounds efficient. As the cautious optimism approached the station, Jake could hear increasing chatter over the comm channels. Apparently, word had gotten out that a human was actually going to attempt this rescue, and half the sector had tuned in to watch what they assumed would be either a miracle or a spectacular disaster. Transport approaching Station Omega-7, Captain Zilt announced, his voice steady despite his obvious nervousness. Human Morrison, you are go for docking bay approach. Copy that, Jake replied, securing his duffel bag and moving toward the airlock. Oh, and Captain, when I get back with the Cubs, maybe have some music ready? Something calm. They're probably pretty stressed. Music, Zilt repeated faintly. For the apex predators. Classical works best. Mozart, if you've got it. The docking bay of Research Station Omega-7 looked exactly like what Jake expected from a place that had been evacuated in panic. Emergency lights cast everything in an ominous red glow. Debris floated in the low gravity, and the walls were decorated with scratch marks that suggested someone, or something, had been very upset about the situation. Jake Morrison, entering the station, he announced over the comm. First impression is that someone really needs to work on their interior decorating. Mr. Morrison, came Vex's voice, tight with worry. Please proceed with extreme caution. The Cubs were last detected in containment level 7. That's the level with the most warning signs. Jake consulted the station map on his wrist display, noting that containment level 7 was helpfully marked with skull symbols and what appeared to be a cartoon drawing of something with too many teeth. Got it. Heading down now, he said, beginning his trek through corridors that looked like they'd been designed by someone with a serious phobia of cheerful lighting. By the way, Command, what exactly were these Cubs doing on a research station in the first place? There was a pause before Vex responded. The research team was studying razorfang behavioral patterns. Specifically, they wanted to understand why the species was so aggressively territorial. Jake stopped walking for a moment. So they took babies away from their parents to study why the parents get upset when people mess with their babies? When you put it like that, it does sound somewhat counterproductive. No wonder the Cubs are scared, Jake muttered, resuming his descent toward level 7. Okay, people, I'm approaching the containment area now. If anyone's got those food replicators warming up, now would be a good time. The entrance to containment level 7 was a masterpiece of intimidation. Warning signs in every known language covered the blast doors like particularly aggressive wallpaper. Someone had even added a few unofficial ones, including what appeared to be a hand-drawn sketch of a stick figure being eaten by something with entirely too many teeth. Mr. Morrison? Vex's voice crackled through the comm. Sensors indicate the Cubs are approximately 30 meters beyond those doors. Heart rate monitors suggest they are agitated. Jake examined the door controls, noting the cheerful red emergency lockdown light that had been blinking for the past several hours. Define agitated. These stress pacing, and have torn through approximately 3 layers of reinforced containment barriers. So, normal scared animal behavior then, Jake said, beginning to override the lockdown sequence, just with better claws. The doors hissed open, revealing a corridor that looked like it had been redecorated by a tornado with anger management issues. Emergency lighting cast everything in that special shade of red that meant abandon hope all ye who enter here, and the air had that particular metallic smell that suggested something with serious dental equipment had been expressing its feelings about the accommodations. Okay, Cubs, Jake called out as he stepped into the corridor, his voice carrying that specific tone every pet owner recognized as, I'm not mad, just disappointed. I know you're scared, but we need to talk about the property damage. A sound echoed from deeper in the containment area. It started as a low growl, built into something that might charitably be called a roar, and finished with what could only be described as the sound of expensive equipment meeting an untimely end. Sounded, came Captain Zilt's nervous voice over the comm, sounded expensive. Mr. Morrison, Vex interrupted, perhaps you should reconsider your approach. Our behavioral experts suggest maintaining maximum distance and using sonic deterrence. Jake paused at the entrance to the main containment chamber, pulling a bag of what appeared to be beef jerky from his utility belt. Your behavioral experts are the same people who thought taking babies away from their parents would be a fun research project, right? Before Vex could respond, Jake stepped into the containment chamber and immediately understood why the rescue teams had been so reluctant to volunteer. The room was large, designed to house dangerous specimens, and currently occupied by 3 creatures that looked like someone had asked a committee of nightmares to design the perfect predator. The razorfang cubs were each about the size of a small earth pony, covered in midnight black scales that seemed to absorb light, and equipped with claws that had clearly been turning the containment furniture into abstract art. Their heads were sleek and reptilian, with rows of crystalline teeth that caught the emergency lighting like malevolent jewelry. When they turned to look at Jake, their eyes glowed with an inner light that suggested they were running on pure adrenaline and bad decision. "Oh, you guys are beautiful," Jake said and meant it. "And absolutely terrified, aren't you?" The largest cub, apparently the designated spokesperson for the group, let out a sound that was part hiss, part growl, and entirely threatening. Its siblings flanked it, forming what any military tactician would recognize as a classic predator formation. "All stations," came a panicked voice over the general comm frequency. "The human just called them beautiful. Repeat, the human finds the apex predators aesthetically pleasing." Jake ignored the commentary, slowly crouching down to make himself less imposing. "Okay, kids, here's the situation. Your temporary accommodations are about to become significantly less temporary due to structural failure. I'm here to help you relocate to somewhere with better lighting and fewer emergency klaxons." The cubs watched him with the intense focus of creatures trying to decide if he was a threat, prey, or something else entirely. Their claws extended and retracted rhythmically, carving deeper grooves into the deck plating. "I know the whole crouching thing doesn't look very impressive," Jake continued conversationally, "but where I come from, we have these animals called cats. Different size, same attitude. The key is showing them you're not going to hurt them, even when they're convinced the whole world is out to get them." He slowly reached into his bag and pulled out a piece of jerky, tossing it gently toward the cubs. It landed about halfway between them, and all 3 creatures immediately focused on it with laser-like intensity. "Food?" Jake explained unnecessarily. "I'm betting you guys haven't eaten much since the evacuation started. Hard to trust the automatic feeding systems when everything's shaking and making horrible noises." The smallest cub, after a moment of internal debate that was visible in its body language, darted forward and snatched the jerky. It retreated immediately, but Jake caught the moment when its aggressive posture relaxed slightly as it realized the food was actually food. "Mr. Morrison," Vex's voice was barely above a whisper, "how are you doing this?" "Basic animal psychology," Jake replied, tossing another piece of jerky, this time closer to the larger cubs. "They're not evil killing machines. They're scared kids who've been abandoned by the adults they trusted. Sound familiar to anyone?" Over the next hour, Jake methodically worked his way closer to the cubs, using a combination of food, patience, and what could only be described as aggressively calm body language. He talked to them constantly, maintaining the same conversational tone he might use with a neighbor's dog. "The thing about being an apex predator," he explained to them while slowly extending his hand for the largest cub to investigate, "is that everyone expects you to be scary all the time. But I bet most of the time, you guys just want to nap in the sun and maybe chase something that moves funny." The largest cub, after several minutes of careful consideration, allowed Jake to touch its snout. Its scales were surprisingly warm, and when Jake scratched behind what might charitably be called ears, the creature made a sound that was unmistakably a purr. "All stations," came Captain Zilt's amazed voice. "Please confirm. Did that apex predator just purr?" "They're basically large carnivorous house cats," Jake said, now confidently petting all 3 cubs, who had apparently decided he was acceptable. "Highly intelligent, very social, and probably missing their parents something fierce." The station shuddered ominously, and several new warning lights began blinking in what Jake assumed was the universal color for "time to leave now." "Okay, kids," he said, standing up slowly. "Field trip time. Who wants to see the inside of a spaceship?" The cubs looked up at him with expressions that suggested they were willing to follow this strange, fearless creature wherever he might lead them. Which, as it turned out, was exactly what the situation required. Getting 3 apex predator cubs to follow you through a collapsing space station, Jake discovered, was surprisingly similar to herding particularly large and toothy ducklings. The cubs had apparently decided that this weird bipedal creature was now their temporary guardian, and they followed him through the corridors with the kind of devoted attention usually reserved for pack leaders or can openers. "Acraze stations, this is Morrison," Jake announced over the comm as they made their way toward the docking bay, the cubs padding along behind him like the galaxy's most dangerous parade. Package secured. 3 healthy cubs, no injuries, currently following me like I owe them treats. The silence that followed lasted exactly long enough for Jake to wonder if his comm had malfunctioned. Morrison, Vex's voice finally crackled through, carrying a tone that suggested he was processing information that didn't fit into any of his existing mental categories. Did you just say they're following you voluntarily? Yeah. Turns out when you treat scared animals like scared animals instead of monsters, they respond pretty well, Jake replied, pausing to let the smallest cub investigate a floating piece of debris. Who knew? The station groaned ominously around them, the sound of metal stress fractures competing with the increasingly urgent emergency klaxons. According to Jake's display, they had maybe 15 minutes before the station's structural integrity reached what engineers like to call the catastrophic failure threshold. Okay, kids, Jake said to the cubs, time to pick up the pace. The nice space station is having some stability issues. As if to emphasize his point, a section of corridor ceiling chose that moment to buckle dramatically, showering them with sparks and debris. The cubs immediately pressed closer to Jake, their protective instincts apparently extending to their new pack leader. Morrison, came Captain Zilt's voice, tight with concern. Sensors show multiple structural failures approaching your position. You need to move faster. Working on it, Jake replied, but he had a problem. The cubs were willing to follow him, but their idea of urgent movement didn't quite match the situation's requirements. They kept stopping to investigate interesting smells, mark territory, or engage in brief play-fighting sessions that would have been adorable if they weren't happening in a collapsing death trap. Hey, Jake called to the largest cub, who had paused to claw experimentally at a wall panel. Focus up, buddy. Save the redecorating for later. It was then that Jake had what he would later describe as either his best or worst idea of the day. Reaching into his bag, he pulled out a small device that looked suspiciously like a dog whistle. All stations be advised, he announced over the comm. About to attempt emergency evacuation procedure. What kind of procedure? Vex asked, though his tone suggested he wasn't sure he wanted to know. Jake put the whistle to his lips and blew. The sound that emerged was barely audible to human ears, but the effect on the cubs was immediate and dramatic. All 3 creatures snapped to attention, their eyes fixed on Jake with laser-like focus. Good, Jake said, beginning to jog toward the docking bay. Now, follow. What happened next would be discussed in xenobiology textbooks for decades. The 3 razor-fang cubs, apex predators whose species had terrorized entire star systems, began following Jake through the corridors in perfect formation, matching his pace exactly and responding to his hand signals like they'd been trained for years. All stations, came a stunned voice over the general frequency. Please confirm visual. Are those apex predators heel training? It's not heel training, Jake panted as they navigated around a collapsed bulkhead. It's pack behavior. They've decided I'm the alpha, so they're following pack protocol. Pack protocol? Vex's voice had reached a pitch that suggested his worldview was undergoing rapid and uncomfortable revision. Predators are social animals, Commander. They understand hierarchy, cooperation, and group survival. The problem is, most people see the teeth and claws and forget about the intelligence behind them. The docking bay was a welcome sight, even though it was currently decorated with several new holes that definitely hadn't been in the original architectural plans. The cautious optimism waited with its cargo bay doors open, Captain Zilt presumably at the controls and ready to depart the moment they were aboard. Transport, this is Morrison, approaching for boarding with passengers. Passengers, Captain Zilt repeated faintly. Right, the apex predators are passengers now. Getting the cubs onto the ship required some creative logistics. They were perfectly willing to follow Jake, but the unfamiliar environment of the cargo bay made them nervous. Jake solved this problem with a combination of patience, treats, and what he privately thought of as aggressive cheerfulness. This is a spaceship, he explained to them, as if conducting a guided tour. It's like a really fast cave that travels between stars. Very safe, excellent climate control, and the artificial gravity is top-notch. The cubs explored their new surroundings with the cautious curiosity of intelligent creatures in unfamiliar territory. When they seemed satisfied that the cargo bay wasn't going to eat them, they settled down in a rough circle with Jake in the center, apparently having decided that their new pack leader needed protection. Morrison to command, Jake announced as the ship undocked from the disintegrating station. All passengers secured and comfortable. Beginning transit to designated drop-off coordinates. Drop-off coordinates? Vex asked. Well, yeah. I assume you've got somewhere safe to take them where they can be reunited with their family group. There was a pause that lasted long enough to be uncomfortable. Mr. Morrison, Vex said carefully, the cub's parents were relocated to a different system when the research began. Standard safety protocol. Jake stopped scratching behind the largest cub's ears, a motion that caused all three creatures to look at him with concern. Let me get this straight, Jake said, his voice carrying a tone that Captain Zilt would later describe as ominous calm. You took babies away from their parents for research purposes, put the parents in a completely different star system, and now you're surprised that the babies are traumatized? When you put it like that... Commander, Jake continued, I'm going to need those parent location coordinates, because these kids are going home. In the cargo bay of the Cautious Optimism, three juvenile razorfangs looked up at their human pack leader with something that might have been trust, while their new guardian began planning what would either be the most heartwarming reunion in galactic history or a diplomatic incident that would require entirely new categories of paperwork. Possibly both. The planet designated as Razorfang Relocation Site Alpha looked exactly like the kind of place bureaucrats chose when they wanted to solve a problem by making it someone else's responsibility. It was a perfectly adequate world with suitable climate, proper atmospheric composition, and the kind of bland, unremarkable terrain that suggested no one had put much thought into whether the relocated inhabitants might actually like living there. All stations, this is Morrison, Jake announced as the Cautious Optimism descended through the atmosphere, his three passengers pressed against the cargo bay viewports with obvious excitement. Approaching designated coordinates for family reunion. Mr. Morrison. Vex's voice carried the tone of someone who had spent the past 18 hours alternating between amazement and administrative panic. I feel compelled to remind you that adult razorfangs are significantly more substantial than their offspring. Jake glanced at the cubs, who were making soft chirping sounds as they recognized familiar scents through the ship's air recycling system. Commander, they're parents who've been separated from their kids for months. I'm more worried about them being traumatized than dangerous. Traumatized apex predators are still apex predators, Morrison. Fair point, Jake conceded, checking his equipment one final time. But I've got a spray bottle and 20 years of experience with upset animals. How bad could it be? The answer to that question became apparent approximately 30 seconds after the cargo bay doors opened. Adult razorfangs, Jake discovered, were impressive in the way that natural disasters were impressive. The two creatures that emerged from the tree line moved with the fluid grace of apex predators and the focused intensity of parents who had been worried sick for months. They were easily 3 times the size of their offspring, covered in the same midnight scales but marked with the scars and bearing of creatures who had earned their place at the top of the food chain. Okay, Jake said, stepping out of the cargo bay with the cubs padding eagerly behind him. Everyone stay calm. This is a happy reunion, not a territorial dispute. The adult razorfang stopped about 50 meters away, their glowing eyes fixed on the small figures following the strange bipedal creature. For a moment, the air was filled with the kind of tension that suggested the universe was holding its breath. Then the smallest cub broke ranks and charged toward the adults with a cry that was unmistakably joyful. What followed was a reunion that would have melted the hearts of every parenting guide ever written, if parenting guides typically included sections on creatures with retractable claws and bioluminescent eyes. The adult razorfangs descended on their offspring with a combination of relief, affection, and the kind of thorough sniffing examination that suggested they were checking for injuries, proper nutrition, and whether anyone had been mean to their babies. All stations, came Captain Zilt's wondering voice over the comm. Please confirm visual. Are those apex predators nuzzling? Family bonding behavior, Jake explained, watching as the reunited family engaged in what could only be described as the galaxy's most dangerous group hug. Perfectly normal for social predators. It was then that the adult razorfangs turned their attention to Jake. The approach of 2 fully grown apex predators should have been terrifying. These were creatures that had hunted battleships, terrorized star systems, and featured in the nightmares of hardened combat veterans. Instead, Jake found himself on the receiving end of what could only be described as the galaxy's most intimidating thank you. The larger adult, presumably the cub's primary guardian, approached Jake with the careful deliberation of a creature trying to express gratitude to something it couldn't quite categorize. When it gently bumped its massive head against Jake's shoulder, the gesture carried a weight of meaning that transcended species barriers. You're welcome, Jake said simply, reaching up to scratch behind the creature's ear ridge. They're good kids. You should be proud. The sound that emerged from the adult razorfang was unlike anything in the galactic databases. It was deep, resonant, and carried emotional undertones that suggested these creatures were far more complex than anyone had given them credit for. Morrison? Vex's voice was barely above a whisper. Sensors indicate the adult specimens are exhibiting what appears to be gratitude behavior? Turns out apex predators are people too, Commander. They just have better teeth and a more direct approach to problem solving. As Jake prepared to leave the reunited family to their catching up, the smallest cub approached him one final time. It looked up at him with those glowing eyes, made a soft chirping sound, and then did something that would be replayed on galactic news feeds for years to come. It gently took Jake's hand in its mouth, careful not to let its razor-sharp teeth make contact with skin, and held it there for a moment in what any animal behaviorist would recognize as a display of trust and affection. "Well," Jake said, gently extracting his hand and giving the cub one final pat, "you guys take care of yourselves, and maybe stay away from research stations for a while." Back aboard the cautious Optimism, as they departed the planet and left the Razorfang family to their reunion, Jake settled into his passenger seat with the satisfaction of a job well done. "Morrison," Vex's voice came over the comm, carrying a tone of profound bewilderment. "I need to ask, how did you know that would work?" Jake considered the question while watching the planet shrink in the viewport. "Commander, every species in the galaxy seems to think humans are either incredibly brave or completely insane for the way we interact with dangerous animals. And which is it?" "Neither," Jake said with a grin. "We just understand something that the rest of you seem to have forgotten. Every creature in the universe, no matter how big, how dangerous, or how many teeth it has, started out as someone's baby. And every parent, whether they breathe oxygen or methane, whether they have fur or scales or tentacles, loves their kids and wants them to be safe." He paused, watching the stars wheel past the viewport. "The thing is, once you remember that, everything else is just details." In the months that followed, Jake's approach to dangerous animal rescue would revolutionize galactic wildlife management. The incident report, filed under Humans Continue to Confound Expectations, would become required reading at the GWPA Academy. And somewhere in the Outer Rim, on a planet with unremarkable terrain and adequate atmospheric composition, a family of apex predators would occasionally look up at the stars and remember the strange, fearless creature who had brought their children home. "So," Vex said finally, "I suppose I should ask, are there any other supposedly impossible rescue situations you'd be interested in tackling?" Jake's grin widened. "Commander, I grew up on a planet where people keep sharks in glass tanks for entertainment and think venomous spiders make good roommates. If you've got any other impossible situations, I'm your guy." And in the vast bureaucratic offices of the Galactic Wildlife Protection Agency, Commander Vex Thorne began updating his files on human capabilities, wondering not for the first time if the galaxy's most dangerous species wasn't the one with claws and fangs, but the one that looked at claws and fangs and thought, "I bet I could teach that to sit." The universe, it seemed, was about to become a much more interesting place.